9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Marc and this is DSR's Above Average Intelligence Show. We have an awesome guest coming on here, but before we get to that, I just want to give a quick shout out to our producer, Joe Vitale. A lot when I talk about leadership and the book I wrote, Clarity in Crisis, I talk about the glue guys and the glue gals, those who are behind the scenes, and Joe is certainly one of them. And I will note he is wearing a New York Rangers shirt today. You can't see him, but he's got to be getting excited about the Blue Shirts' upcoming season. He also is a fellow heavy metal fan, and we've had a discussion on whether I can put any Slipknot songs as the intro here. I've been denied by the powers that be, but that's okay. I'll just kind of sing it in the back of my head. But anyway, shout out to Joe. He's the one behind the scenes who makes this happen. Today, I am thrilled to welcome as my guest David Gioe, which is, of course, like the GeoInt for all the kind of the Intel nerds out there. But David is a British Academy Global Professor of Intelligence and International Security in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Before working there, he was a tenured Associate Professor of History at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He's also the Director of Studies for the Cambridge Security Initiative, which is a month-long program held every summer in the UK, which I was honored to come speak at this year, and it was a tremendous time. I felt like I was in Harry Potter land in St. John's College, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But David is someone who is widely respected in the intelligence field. He writes prolifically. He is quoted quite a bit, and I've wanted to have him come on the show for some time. David, thrilled to have you here.
Well, thanks so much, Marc. And as you say, I tweeted GeoInt, which I can't take credit for. It was either that or geopolitics, but there's plenty of smarter people on international relations than me. So I thought I'd just keep it nice and tight with the int.
So let me just say once again, you run a program in the summer, which is extraordinary. It lasts a month, correct? About a month, and you bring in speakers from all over the world, and I really felt fortunate to be invited to come. I stopped by on the way back from Greece, but one of the things I also did, not only give a lecture on the Middle East, but I spent the day with your students who, when you do that, and they're global, they're from all over the world, but I don't know if you felt this way or you feel this way, but I walked away from that thinking that, the national security sphere is in good hands with Generation Z. They were, frankly, far more impressive, far better educated than I certainly was when I rolled into CIA. But what an amazing group of folks. I'm sure you that month in the summer is kind of one of the highlights of your year.
It's the highlight of my year. It's been going since 2013, and I was the founding co-convener with Mike Goodman of King's College London, and I'm the director of studies, which basically means that any sort of academic issues bubble up to me. But as you say, the students are amazing, and one of the things that I think you could kind of get jaundiced a little bit, about college students today, like if you watch the news or and Marc's, some of the stuff that you tweet about, right? And as a parent, I get, I don't know, private messages from people with college, high school kids who are going to go to college. And I get a lot of private messages, be like, Dave, like what is going on with universities? I got 300 grand saved up. I don't want my kid to get dumber for that kind of money. What's going on here? And, it's a whole separate conversation, but the college students get bad press, and the what you're seeing on TV or whatever, that's just the loudest 3% or whatever. And the overwhelming majority of them are, dedicated and interested and engaged and, ready to enter public service. And so, you might not think it because, working in a university context can sometimes be a little bit, frustrating for all the reasons that you see on television or you read in the newspaper. But, I always try to take the opportunity to stand up for the overwhelming majority of college students that do have a good head on their shoulders, and many of whom want to get smart on intelligence topics so that they can serve either our country or our allies or, in Western intelligence services.
And I'll just kind of give maybe a bit of advice to others like both of us, I forgot to mention as well, you also are a former intelligence officer. You served honorably in the U.S. intelligence community. And what I'm going to say now is, for those of us who are often asked to go speak at universities, and I'm heading to Virginia Tech tomorrow, in fact, to do 2 days of lectures. There's you kind of roll into class and you give your 2 cents. But what I did with you all is actually, did a little bar hopping, hopping. And that 3 or 4 hours when you spend with the students informally, I mean, that's where you do those that kind of mentoring. I think I held office hours during the day for 4 or 5 hours. And so that's what you do. It's not just rolling in for a 45 or 50-minute lecture, but it's spending time with the students because they want to pick your brain. What's it like to work in the intelligence community? How do you get in? What's the process? What are the work-life balance of a case officer? And so, that to me was the most memorable time. But I got to throw one kind of notion out there. There is no air conditioning, I think, in the entire country of England. And so, it's in the middle of summer, and I thought I was going to, melt. So, that if I come back next year, you got to do something about that. You probably can't actually.
But you actually got lucky with the weather. It's usually much worse. But I think you're totally right about the difference between just rocking up and giving a presentation and really engaging with these students. And I find that I can't keep up. You held office hours. You held a zillion office hours while you were there, and you just can't keep up with it with the number of requests for your time. But the reason why that's true is because people like us who have, kind of been there and done that, we're a rare commodity, right? Most, we don't teach at universities or actually have posts usually at universities, or if we do, they're kind of adjuncty posts where you're not really there full time. And so, students have all these questions built up because we want to talk about, high politics or whatever. And they just want to know, can I get married to a foreign national?
Right, exactly.
Or are you going to ask me to do something that I think is unethical? Or, you get a million of these kind of basic questions. And so, having being available to students, I think, is the number one thing, right? It's like fatherhood, Mark, right? Like, just show up,
Yeah.
and the rest will kind of take care of
All
itself.
right, so I'll make a pledge that I got to get back there next summer. We'll do it again.
Excellent.
All right, so let's jump into the topics we've taken. Actually, this has been a really fun conversation. I could talk about this all day because I think passing the torch to the next generation is critical. But I do want to get into some substantive topics in our time here today. Let me just throw out, we start off often with current events, and there was a piece, I believe, in the Washington Post the other day, but it talked about how Russia had kind of switched or had maybe is reusing once again Mexico, the country of Mexico, their embassy, their residency in Mexico. Russian intelligence services are using that as a kind of a spy hub in terms of to get kind of north at the United States. What are your thoughts on that? And you have an understanding of history here because Russia has used the Soviet Union did. The KGB has used Mexico as an intelligence hub in the past, but it looks like history is repeating itself. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts are that Russian intelligence, it's a little bit like Jello, right? It's been squeezed in Europe, and it's just going to come out in other places, right? So it entirely stands to reason that the Russian intelligence services, in this case, their external service, the SVR, and their military intelligence service, the GRU, it makes total sense that they're just going to go where they have the most freedom of action. And that's true, in places where, as you know, NATO countries have largely cracked down on Russian intelligence. It's no longer the playground that it was, at least for most of our careers. And so they have to go somewhere else. Many Russians, there's one estimate, public estimate, that says about 600, Europe has PNG'd or kicked out about 600 Russian intelligence officers since about 2022. And yeah, fine, they're going to go back to Moscow, but then they're going to retool, re-equip, and redeploy, right?
So how do you combat this now? Obviously we're going to, I would imagine we have a discussion with the Mexican government about this, but then the FBI has a role here because they're going to be obviously watching what am I going to say now, a porous border. So there's been so much focus about the U.S.-Mexican border in terms of perhaps on the counterterrorism threat about terrorists getting in. But is this kind of easy access, maybe for Russian intelligence officers, to come across? Or I mean, is that something that the FBI should be concerned with?
The FBI should definitely be concerned, I think, both ways, right? Defectors also leaving. There have been plenty of defectors who have reached Cuba via Mexico. As early as 1961, there were a pair of NSA officers who were the kind of the early Edward Snowdens, called was it Mitchell and I can't remember the other one right now. But they defected to Russia. They actually popped up and did a sort of Snowden style interview in 1961, and they said NSA are the bad guys, and they had their whole spiel, and they got to Cuba via Mexico. I mean, I think as two former case officers, I think we're also thinking offensively. Great, so now all of a sudden there's a bunch of Russians far away from home.
Right.
Can we get to them? Right. And so I think that's the difference between, maybe the Bureau thinking sort of defensively, but hopefully case officers are thinking offensively. Right. Okay, maybe you've served up some more of these people and it's now easier for them to defect, right, than it ever has before. So let's see if we can capitalize on that.
I think the statement you made, Russian intelligence is like Jello. Squeezed out of Europe and perhaps the U.S. and moving to Mexico. I might have to use that again.
It's copywritten Gioe int.
Okay, it is it now. Okay, well I will cite you on that.
All right.
Let's switch just to a topic that I think you will be very well versed to discuss, considering, of course, where we're talking to you from, which is the UK, and that's the special relationship between the US and the British intelligence services. And as someone who, I spent 26 years at CIA, most of the time in the Middle East, where we did work quite closely with our British partners. Oftentimes there was a bit of a rivalry. If you're both serving in the same country, there's a limited pool of asset candidates, perhaps, but it really is an incredible relationship. And then one of the things that I learned, of course, when I finished my career in the Europe and Eurasia Mission Center was, of course, really seeing up close the incredible nature of the relationship. And it's not just on signals intelligence, which clearly we share a lot of, but even on human intelligence as well. But talk about where that is, and I want to dive into politics just a little bit here. We're not going to get anyone in trouble, me or you. But is it I do want to kind of explore the notion: is this survivable across different American administrations, in particular when perhaps different candidates have a differing view of Europe? But talk about the overall relationship, what it means and what the future looks like.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Well, so I did my PhD dissertation on the Anglo-American.
You know a little bit about it. Okay, just a little.
Yeah, well, I've probably forgotten most of it, but it does go back. Well, some people say it goes back to the First World War, but most people place it at 1940 as the Russia. The UK is at war with Nazi Germany, and they're trying to get the Americans in, and so they really kind of come over to the U.S. and vice versa. There's lots of trips, and both sides are pretty open kimono, actually, when you consider that intelligence agencies are very sort of secretive things, and in fact, in the British system, the intelligence services didn't even exist, right? They weren't even avowed until the 1990s, and so in any case. It goes back. And I think, let me just say a couple of things as preamble. The first one is that, I'm a believer in the special relationship, but there's a bunch of special relationships, and it's important to disentangle them so that way we can drill into the intelligence version of it, right? There's a special political relationship, right? We go invade Iraq together, we sign various agreements and diplomacy, or there's defense relationships, right, with nuclear submarines and AUKUS. And, every time you go to the British MOD, everyone has, an American on their team, right? Everyone is all over. I've been living here for 6 years, and I'm still a Navy Reserve officer. I've done several periods of duty here in the UK. And each door you go through, there's another American that you didn't know worked in that office. Right. And so they're just so close. So there's lots of different there's special relationships, but the special intelligence relationship even has, that's the beating heart of the Anglo-American relationship, in my view. Right, that's the calm beneath, sort of the political waves. Right, that's the thing where even if the politicians, are having a screaming match in public or in private, right, we're just sort of carrying on, right, at the working level. And and you mentioned SIGINT, right? And there's even different varietals of special intelligence relationships. There's a special signals intelligence relationship between NSA and GCHQ that's the most significant and the most intertwined. If you go to NSA headquarters, you will see the British, crown and crest or coat of arms or whatever it's called, right, on an office, right? British people go to work every day at NSA and vice versa at GCHQ, and that's publicly acknowledged. And then you go to the imagery intelligence relationship, and then finally the one you were talking about, which is the sort of the least close of the group of most close things, which is the human relationship. And yeah, sometimes we can disagree and we can be rivals, at times. But ultimately, this is simply the closest relationship actually in the history of intelligence relationships.
And I think that one of the things that's interesting as someone who kind of, I spent my, I don't know, 26 years at the agency, the British intelligence officers I met the beginning of my career have now, I'm retired now, but I just learned that the famous Q, and I won't say the person's name, but it's someone that I worked with in the field in the past. And I kind of got a kick out of that. I think it's important to note that as in our counterintelligence education, when you come into the agency, of course there are countries which are our adversaries, and then there are countries that are frenemies, and then there are some allies or countries we work with. But on a serious note, there's countries like the UK where we actually really don't spy on. And I can say that conclusively just because there's been so much written on it. But it is very rare that you have any partner in which you really don't. With a liaison relationship, two things happen. One is you want to work together, and you also want to penetrate them. And we do that sometimes with some allies outside the Five Eyes. With the Brits, we don't. And I think there's that level of trust. Because of that, there's a level of trust and a level of openness. And I always found that refreshing. But one of the things, too, is that the British services are smaller than ours. And so, how does that kind of come into play? What is it like for, as you're living there now? I mean, it's hard to get into the CIA. We always joke, and I didn't go to Harvard, but it's harder to get into the CIA than it is to get into Harvard, whatever that means. But how, what's it like, the process of getting into the British intelligence community? Is it really still for the elite? And that's changed in the United States, I think, for the good. But for the British services, what's your experience been in terms of kind of their practice? What kind of pool do they recruit from for their personnel?
Yeah, it was, sort of the classic, skull and bones, tap on the shoulder kind of thing. Sir Richard Dearlove, former chief of the service, tells the story that, at Queen's College, Cambridge, in 1968 or whatever it was, 66, he got tapped on the shoulder at the age of 21. And, do you want to work for the Queen? I can't tell you more.
Right.
And, sort of classic stuff. Now it's not the case. The entirety of the British intelligence services have really sort of gone away from the Oxbridge type recruiting model, and now like every other sort of modern at least Western service, right, you can apply online. And
Right.
So I think some of the class-based undertones, and frankly, I don't think they've been true for a while. And Mark, you'll know, one of the things that people always talk about CIA, being male, pale, Yale, and stale. Fine, that was true in the OSS, and that's true in 1950. But by the 70s, it's actually not true, right? This is one of these things that just won't die. The agency is, I met more people that went to Texas A&M that went to Yale.
There is a cult of the agency of Texas A&M grads at the agency. That is true.
Yeah, there sure are. So I think a lot of these things probably we just have to kind of keep up with the times. but the Brits, I think they do have slightly different security requirements for vetting and for trust. We have differences just for example, between the U.S. and the U.K. systems with dual passport holders. We are more tolerant as a whole than the Brits are of that. And for us, anytime you become a U.S. citizen, that's it, right? Then you can apply. The Brits don't have that. There's various waiting. I don't know exactly what they are, but there's various waiting periods. And so we do, while I think, recruiting is sort of largely similar and democratized and merit-based and wide ranging, our security and vetting processes are a little bit different.
Interesting. All right, but you didn't answer that one question. Is it sustainable over changing administrations? I would say the answer is yes, but what's your thoughts?
So it is, but it is for reasons that you might not figure. So especially on the SIGINT side, they've grown up like picture a hedgerow in France or in Cornwall, England or something, right? There are these intertwined roots, and you literally can't, even if President Biden or a future president were to say, I hate the Brits, I'm so mad at them, turn off the pipes, you literally couldn't do it.
They're kind of our pipes too, right? That's how intertwined.
Right. They're so intertwined. I'll give you two bits. The first one comes from General Hayden's book, his first book called Playing to the Edge, where in the lead up to 9/11, there was a lot of chatter. And Hayden, who was then the NSA director, calls up his counterpart, David Pepper, the GCHQ director, and says, "Look, if it's Fort Meade that gets hit, can you please take over running U.S. SIGINT from Cheltenham?"
Amazing.
Right. So the fact that that's even possible, they're their pipes, they're our pipes. The satellites, right? They are just ours. And so there's no way, even if it would be like it's not a celebrity divorce, right? Where like, you take your shit and I take my shit and we go, right? You can't, everything is sort of commonly held. There's one great story. I was just talking to a British friend, and he was he was somewhere else in the Middle East where the British have a large collection station. And he said, hey, what does this switch do? And nobody knew. And why are they paying for it? So they turned it off. And like 30 seconds later, they got a call from NSA being like, what the hell did you guys do? Right. So they don't even know where some of this stuff goes because it's so entrenched at the working level. So fine, if a president could say FBI stop working with MI5 or CIA stop working with MI6 or whatever, but on imagery, because the platforms are shared, the down stations are shared, and on SIGINT, you couldn't disentangle it even if you wanted to, right? And that's the legacy of us being so close for so long. Richard Nixon was pissed off about the lack of U.S. support in Vietnam and did try to sort of, make threats. There were threats, as you probably know, more recently with Huawei, right? Because the Brits were, I think a little bit recalcitrant about, or a little bit optimistic, let's say, about keeping Huawei infrastructure in the UK. It proved to be a whole stink. So it's not that everyone is on the same page all the time, but to disentangle what the last 70 years has put together, I think would be almost impossible.
You are a person of great quotes today. It's not a celebrity divorce. I love that.
I'm not a celebrity, so I don't really know.
That's
but
really good. No, I like that. And I think that it's. If you recall, what was it, a week ago, when Bill Burns and Richard Moore, the head of SIS, British intelligence, the head of course, CIA and British intelligence, were together at I believe it was a Financial Times conference. Extraordinary joint event. Yeah.
It's come to the fore, right? It's always been that level of close, right? They, Americans and senior British intelligence officers sit on couches together literally every day. But the fact that they're now doing it in public, right? And I'll draw your attention back to FBI Director Chris Wray, and I think you might have mentioned MI5 Director Ken McCallum holding a joint press conference here in London, I don't know, a year or something ago, talking about China. And I think there was even a Five Eyes, like the heads of the Five Eyes were on 60 Minutes or something.
That's right, yeah.
About, I don't know, is that a year ago?
All the domestic chiefs, correct?
Right. So it's coming to the fore publicly, in ways that had always happened privately, but the public aspect is the new dimension. And let me just add one quick point on that, which is that the special relationship is one of those funny things where intelligence practitioners believe in it, right? It is a thing. You believe in it. I believe in it. We've seen it. We've worked in it. It exists. But many journalists don't think it exists. Many politicians don't think it exists. And loads of academics don't think that it exists. And there's this great quote from an academic who is very knowledgeable, but I vehemently disagree with. And he basically said the special relationship is sort of like this party that's been over for years, but the guests won't leave because they're spellbound by the storied past. And it's a nice turn of phrase, but it's just literally not true. And I've always found it fascinating. As an academic, we're always supposed to chase research puzzles, right? And like, why is it that the practitioners believe it exists, but the people that comment on it don't think it exists? And anyway, that's maybe a different question, but something that I've been writing more and more about.
One of the things that I think about, and again, back to your old life and my old life as case officers, is when you serve in the intelligence community, the kind of for lack of a better term, the sexy part is recruiting a unilateral asset. That's when we spot, assess, develop, recruit, and handle a penetration of the Russian military, the Chinese intelligence service, the Iranian nuclear program, et cetera, et cetera. We do it. It's and that's what you kind of see out of the movies, for lack of a better term. But half of one's job, certainly as a case officer, as you get later on into your career, when you are declared to a liaison service, but half of a CIA station's kind of operational directive is working with liaison, and that I think is a skill, and I think it's important. It might not make a good movie, but what do liaison services like the British do? Well, they help us catch spies. They help us, with counterproliferation, stopping weapon shipments. Certainly help us on counterterrorism. It's a massive value added. And then on hard target areas, same thing, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. I mean, our joint efforts, it's a huge value added. And I think that there's a skill that, perhaps we, even as former intelligence officers, don't acknowledge enough. People get promoted at CIA for recruiting unilateral sources, but I don't think there's enough attention given to just the notion of partnerships and it's going to sound like a tough term, but working them. Just like the Brits are going to work us, we're going to work them. But it really is value added for both sides. But I just wanted to throw that out there as a former case officer as well. I mean, liaison is a big component of our job. It doesn't get the press, but boy, it's important.
Yeah, I give a lecture called "Lies the Practitioners Told Me," and one of them, is essentially saying what you've said, right? Is that the key to the realm and real intelligence is that unilateral recruitment of that hard target. But in actuality, I would bet you the overwhelming majority of intelligence reports that come in are actually coming in from as a product of liaison cooperation and exchange. And the unilateral reports, while tremendously valuable, are probably the minority.
So this is the point in the podcast where we have to say goodbye to our guests who are not yet subscribers. If you want to listen to the rest of the podcast and to all of our other shows in full, just go to the dsrnetwork.com and click on membership. It's only $7 a month, and it brings you a lot of great bonus content. So if you're not a subscriber, we hope you will be soon. And if you are one, stand by. We'll be right back. All right, we are back with David Gioe for our bonus content. And I think there's going to be there's a fascinating conversation to be had, and this is I'm going to raise this as someone who many people, and I joke around about this, accuse me of being part of this kind of mythical deep state, which I find utterly ludicrous, of course, but it does go to an important point, and that's kind of the kind of increasingly tenuous linkage between the U.S. national security community, including the intel agencies, and a skeptical public. In the old days, you were told, ignore the political noise, just keep your head down, do your job for the American people. But, the IC really is coming under some scrutiny. So can you talk about that, just the general notion of the skepticism of the intelligence community, but also why it matters, because Congress is made up of of representatives. And sometimes you see things such as the Congress's recent attempts to strip really critical authorities, such as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA 702, which we've talked to before on this show. So, talk a little bit about, the overall perception of the IC for the American public and why that actually matters in terms of how our former employers can need to do their job.
Right, absolutely. As you say, right. So in the old days, there was always political chatter, and the managers would tell the junior officers, the working level officers, it's going to be okay. Tune out the noise, just do a good job, and it's all going to be well. And why that? I'm just terrified, and I'm not alone, right? I think General Hayden and I actually wrote a piece in Foreign Policy about this, and your listeners can Google that, my name and Hayden's name in Foreign Policy and find the piece.
You're in good company, by the way, with the general. He's a great man.
Yes, one of the smartest guys in any room. And the thing is, you might actually lose your operating authorities, and so you can't keep your head down and do your job because you might not have the authorities to do your job. So let me hit you with some terrifying and I think disheartening statistics. I think I have three of them. Recently, 70% of Americans surveyed said they were, quote, very or, quote, somewhat concerned about, quote, interference by the FBI and intelligence agencies in a future presidential election. Just think about that, right? The people that go to work every day to keep the holy of holies safe in a democracy are voting, right? 70% of Americans think that they're concerned about that. In 2021, 56% of Americans thought the U.S. intelligence community, quote, plays a vital role in warning against foreign threats and contributes to our national security. Just think about that, right? So in 2022, an alarming 44% of Americans did not believe the IC keeps them safe from foreign threats or contributes to U.S. national security. And also in 2022, my last stat for you, 17% of Americans thought that the intelligence community represented a threat to their civil liberties, right? 1 in 5. These polls are alarming. They're going in the wrong direction. And if the authorities do get pulled, 702 just, being one of them, right? But if they get pulled, we already, I had a boss who once told me, I was complaining about, this is a funny, sort of junior officer story. I was complaining once about paperwork and authorities and what I couldn't do and why did I have to do this? And he said, believe me, Dave, I wish we had the Russians authorities, but we don't. We already are so careful to protect. I mean, I shouldn't say we, I'm not part of it anymore, but as you know, it's a force of habit. But the IC is so attuned to the idea of civil liberties, and they comply with the law. And when they don't, right, it gets reported to Congress, and there's a whole stink that happens. And so people don't understand, and these polls, I just think are really scary because of the tenuous nature of the relationship now between what's supposed to be, right, the first line of defense. If you don't trust that, then you're not going to be able to do your job.
So, I think as a CIA officer, we understand you're not going to get a pat in the head from the American public. I do get that. I've said this many times, in any forums that, I never knew the political leanings of any of my colleagues at the agency. I just didn't. I didn't care. So first of all, you're in a SCIF, a secure facility. So you don't follow Twitter. You don't follow kind of the day-to-day or the minute-by-minute events. And you just kind of put your nose to the ground. And you're doing your job, especially if you're posted overseas. But I think that there is, that is kind of the nature of a very politicized country now, that this is an issue. So I guess the next question for you, and this is put your academic hat on now, is, how do you change is the wrong word, but so how do you kind of counteract that narrative? Is it more transparency? What can the CIA do in order to, because when I say regain the trust, I think it's kind of bullshit if we lost the trust, because I don't think anything was done. But how do you change that narrative? Because again, I think that you're right in the sense, intelligence is the first line of defense. Espionage is the second oldest profession. We got to do this. we are the ones standing, on the ramparts protecting the American people. So how do we kind of write this narrative that does seem to be seeping into the American body politic?
Yeah, I have a couple ideas, and I'll give them to you. I was just going to echo what you said though about not knowing your colleagues' political views. And when I entered on duty, it was John Brennan was then the deputy executive director, and he came into my class. We all put our hands up and swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and he said, "Great." He said, "Now leave your cell phones and your political opinions in the parking lot. Don't bring them into the building." And people respected that. In terms of what do we do about it, I think we have to just spend a minute saying, like, admitting how we got here, right? Like, the crown jewels in the 1970s, and people don't trust the government, and Watergate and Vietnam, and so if you go back, right, there is some historical basis to it. And then, of course, both sides of the political aisle have taken some real cheap shots at the agency, and I mean, going back, 15 years. I'm not even trying to, identify any one politician. You can go to PolitiFact, right, and there's been lots of different corrections. So some of it's, and then, finally, Snowden leaks and that kind of stuff, right? You sort of have highly tangentious reporting where you have some evidence, but you don't really understand what the evidence is. And then so your mind as a reporter goes to the darkest, most conspiratorial part of the room. And that's just not how it is. Anyway, but you asked, how do we fix it? And I do think it starts with a mixture of transparency, declassifying as much as we possibly can, being more responsive. People want to write about the agency and they want to do it based on real documents. And I don't know what the backlog is for freedom of information, but I think it's pretty epic. Making the case publicly, right? One of the things that we saw when 702 looked like it was in real danger. In the lead up to that, you saw people from both the DNI and the administration declassifying more and more operational vignettes
Right.
that were showing success stories.
I think the Zawahiri strike and one was aided by 702.
Yeah, millions, the drug stuff, of fentanyl, whatever, all this stuff is aided by 702. They declassified a statistic that I can't even remember it now, but it said something like, but 59% of the PDB it was thereabouts. I can't remember the exact number, but some crazy majority of the president's daily brief, was derived from 702 stuff. That doesn't hurt anybody to come forward and say stuff like that, right? You and I are all about protecting sources and methods. We would never hurt anything like that. But you can say more to the American people than I think you can, and that's basically a culture shift. The DNI has recognized the problems of overclassification, right? And as you know, you might as well just market secret because you can never get in trouble for overclassifying, but you can sure as hell get in trouble for underclassifying something. And so over time, this just becomes a culture. And then finally, what I do is, I teach about this stuff. But as one academic, Amy Ziegert, out in California, she's got this great line. She said she was looking at college catalogs, and she was looking at history classes, and there are more histories of rock and roll than there are histories of intelligence. And so she had this great line that I've stolen many times that said, a college student is more likely to encounter U2, the rock band, than U2, the spy plane. And so part of it is just is educating in the classroom. And unfortunately, because there's so few classes or degree programs in intelligence or intelligence studies, that we've left it to Hollywood, right? We've left it to infotainment. We've left it to charlatans on the internet or wherever. And so if we can help young people, understand the stuff, and I tell them all the time, you don't have to agree with Dave Gioe. I'm just trying to help you understand, what the terms are and what the resources are and why this matters in history, right? The so-called missing dimension. And I spend so much time in the classroom just sort of, I don't want to say debunking, right? But, I had a college student. I mean, this is a true story. I had a cadet at a U.S. Service Academy ask me if 9/11 was an inside job.
Right.
And so this stuff this stuff penetrates so many, you're not insulated from it because you wear a uniform or because you have a PhD or because whatever. And so it's so important that I think we spend more time talking about intelligence, researching it, and then making real documents and real files available to researchers so that they're not just guessing or they're not just re footnoting old bad information, right? But they actually have accurate information to work with.
Well, I certainly like that notion of how this can kind of begin with, when someone in college is interested in the intelligence community, they're taking a class and you're just being very transparent on what's occurring. I think that's a fantastic idea. I mean, I definitely also wonder, and American politics has changed so much. And I think, I would be hypocritical not to mention this. I mean, I've obviously been very open in my political views, which only occurred, of course, after I retired. And so many people asked me, said, would it be better for former intelligence officers to not talk about politics, to get involved? And I said, well, I said maybe. But these are, to me, more extreme times. I mean, so I'm not making an excuse. I'm just explaining why I have chosen to speak out on politics. But there certainly is a price to pay for that. I would just argue that I think this is just a unique time. And I do also look at, there's no right or wrong. I mean, I look at other countries, there's former, Israeli generals and former Israeli Mossad directors who are very involved in the political sphere. And so, but there's, I think there's an argument to be made that under ordinary circumstances, perhaps it's better for those of us formers not to speak out. Again, I would just argue, and perhaps this is my kind of own chain of thought here. These are unique circumstances, so that is why I have chosen to do so. Others certainly may feel otherwise.
Yeah, I think it can be hard. I mean, for me, I still have U.S. government affiliations. And so when I speak, it's just Dave Gioe. It's not any other government affiliation. But I think it is really hard because we are in unprecedented times. I mean, and as a historian, right, we don't like to use the word unprecedented, but I think we are, just as a matter of fact, in unprecedented times. I think that's true. And I think the hard part, right, is this spectrum, because in the old days, you were supposed to go to Vermont and grow Christmas trees and keep your mouth shut, right? That was the implicit agreement. And, and yet, and then of course at the other end, there's endorsing political candidates or whatever. I think for me, where I've landed, I mean, not that anybody cares, what I think anyway, but, I think where I've landed is I've tried to make, when intelligence or security topics are raised by politicians in particular, or by sort of tangentious journalists or whatever, I try to make them teachable moments. Right. And so I try to say, look, okay, you might have heard this, or you might have heard that, here's probably what I think the real truth is. And if I can, I'll reach into some declassified evidence to support it. But the problem is that if you say nothing, right, you entirely cede the dialogue.
Right.
And one of the things that I've learned is that Marc, you and I think that our brains are impervious to propaganda or whatever, right? But research, time and time again, shows that you can believe some absolutely crazy shit if you are told it often enough, right? If there's repetition, if you're told it by someone in a position of authority, and if there's no counter narrative to try to pull you the other way, right? And so, my students all the time, think, well, I would have been a good German in the Second World War, and I wouldn't have gotten involved in that stuff. Or, when I teach U.S. history, okay, maybe if I were born in Alabama in 1810, I would have been an abolitionist. Maybe. I hope that's true. But, the overwhelming majority of people and of research suggests that actually, we can think some pretty crazy stuff under the conditions that I just mentioned. And so the role that you play is an authoritative voice pulling in the other direction, which is one of those key things to combat, misinformation or disinformation.
Well said. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for. David, you've been fantastic. David Gioe, former intelligence officer, an incredible kind of historian, academic, someone who runs an amazing program, the Cambridge Security Initiative, every summer. If there's any students out there, in fact, listening today, please jump in and take a look at that. But I want to thank you for joining us. I hope you'll consider doing so again soon. There's a ton to talk about. And I also want to thank everyone out there for listening. DSR will be back later this week with more of our regularly scheduled podcasts, and we hope you'll join us for them. And then join me again for the DSR Above Average Intelligence Show next week. David, this has been a delight. We could have done this for several hours, and you know what we'll do? Maybe next summer we'll do a podcast from the UK.
That sounds perfect.
But thanks so much for coming on. I encourage everyone to follow David on social media and certainly in all of his writings. David, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.